On the 29th of January 2021, a newly revealed game began making the rounds known as The Day Before, with directing and acting on par with that of Neil Breen. And though there was initial interest in the game, that interest would quickly turn to anger and resentment over time, with the game being regarded as the worst game and biggest scam in the history of gaming. But is this the truth? Today, I want to go over the turbulent history of not only The Day Before, but also the studio behind it, Fntastic, to showcase why I believe that this game was never meant to be a scam, but instead the result of another issue, management. I'm not trying to be Fntastic's white knight or anything, but after looking a little deeper into this company, I have devised a separate explanation as to why The Day Before turned out the way it did. Just gonna say this now, but of course, nothing here is 100% confirmed until we get actual word from the studio, though I don't think that will be possible for a couple of reasons. Anyways, on Fntastic's now defunct website, we can see that they actually began in 2015, about 6 years before The Day Before was even announced. At first, they weren't known as Fntastic. They instead went by the name 8point, named as such to reference the original 8 developers that came together to start the studio. Out of these 8, the only 2 that we know for certain were a part of this group were Edward Gotovzev and his brother Aizen Gotovzev. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that last name. And also this guy Alex. I didn't notice him the first time while I was writing the script, but I found out after editing, so hey, here you go. Though Edward was more important as he would become the CEO of the company and director on practically all of their projects. As 8point was a newly found indie studio, they need to secure funding before being able to release their first fully developed game. Enter The Wild 8, a Kickstarter campaign launched on April 5th, 2016 with a small little goal of just $50,000. The campaign itself isn't really important, it's basically on par with that of Shock Fu, where many people didn't receive their codes and whatnot even years after supporting. Yes, I'm shamelessly plugging that video, go watch it after this, don't click off yet. Anyways, the campaign was successfully funded at a nice $59,000, and the game would later release on Steam on the 8th of February 2017. The Steam page says October of 2019, but their discussion page shows updates dating back to 2017, most likely as early access with the full release in 2019. I want you to keep in mind that it took them at the very least 2 years to create this game. At the same time they announced their official release date, they would also announce the changing of their name from 8points to Fntastic. Now, this game was a disaster upon release. With so many bugs and glitches, you'd have a better time just smashing your head against a wall. And 8 months after its initial release, Fntastic decided to just sell the rights to their publisher, Hype Train Digital, and just move on to other projects, though the game would still be listed under the Fntastic name. We already get a little sense of what kind of developers these people are. Rush to put out a game before it's ready to meet some sort of deadline or possibly raise money, and if people don't like it, just move on. Now, during the development of The Wild 8, they must have also been somewhat in development of their next title, Dead Dozen, which ended up being released in March of 2018. Again, considering it takes them 2 years to make a game. Or maybe they did just do it in 5 months, as this game was clearly a poorly put together asset flip with glitches all over the place. And funnily enough, someone called this game dead not too long after release, as it only peaked at 5 players, to which the developers responded by banning him from all discussions and flagging his actual honest review of the game as abusive and off topic. But there's something I want you to take away from this. It's that if we are to believe that they actually took their time with this game, these guys worked on 2 projects simultaneously. And I can't find any Dead Dozen Kickstarter or Indiegogo campaign, so I assume they were borrowing the money they raised from the initial Kickstarter, which is clearly deceptive as the money should be used for what was promised, but also shows abundantly poor management. Who else but the CEO and director would make a choice like this? Not to mention that they were still an 8-person team. Sure, they may have had help from the publisher Hype Train, but that doesn't change the fact that working on 2 games simultaneously is damn near impossible for any dev team without one or even both of the games suffering in quality. Anyways, Dead Dozen is no longer on Steam, and I'll give you 5 seconds to guess as to why. Alright, time's up. It's because the devs moved on, who would have guessed? But this technically isn't the end of Dead Dozen just yet, it'll come back a little later. Almost immediately after they abandoned it, on July 30th, 2018, they released their next title, Radiant 1. There isn't much to say about this game, it's basically a simply made mobile game, but at least they made something they were actually capable of, and this game seems to be the only game of theirs that still holds positive reviews. Other than that, this would have been around the time that The Day Before would have started development. After officially being released, Fntastic mentioned that they poured their blood, sweat, and tears into this project for the past 5 years. 2023 minus 5 equals 2018. We'll just take them at their word for now. Before we go on, I want to quickly mention that there was no official evidence that the studio grew to more than 8 developers. If anything, there's evidence against that, as we'll see in a little bit. But for now, let's just assume that they are still a small indie studio. I don't want to place a number on them, but I'll just say at most 20 developers, and that's probably still being generous. Considering the scope of something like The Day Before, you would think that maybe they would want to focus all their efforts and attention into this one project. Game development development can take around anywhere from a couple of months to a couple of years to complete, and that's even with a large skilled team, not to mention a hell of a lot of money, which is why many studios, especially indie studios, focus their efforts on just one at a time. But whether it may have been a lack of confidence the day before or ambitions that exceed reality, Fntastic decided that they would again begin working on 2 games simultaneously. In the same year the day before was announced, Prop Night was also announced. This was just a regular prop hunt game with some added mechanics, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't take a good amount of work. And considering it was released 2 months after its announcement in December of 2021, I would assume the game had been in development for at least 2 years, as that's just our little magic number, meaning that the day before and Prop Night would have been in development at the same time at some point, again with such a small team and hardly any money, as nobody was buying Dead Dozen or Radiant 1, and the Wild 8 wasn't earning them much as they had already sold it to Hype Train. But thankfully, an angel would descend upon their shoulders in the form of an investor, Mytona, another video game company and publisher, and also the creators of the Mytonaverse. They must have seen all this exciting gameplay and decided to start funding Fntastic in order to make this game a reality, which is why the reveal trailer looked the way it did. Clearly it was pre-rendered to sell it to investors. And with this newfound money, Edward told his team, "I know working on 2 games will be tough, guys, but we can do it. Oh, and also we're going to work on a 3rd game as well, so make sure to say goodbye to your families as you aren't seeing them for a while." Alright, maybe that was an exaggeration, but Edward was actually considering it, as on February of 2021, he came out of nowhere on the Dead Dozen discussants page to inform their 3 remaining players that they would begin working on the game as soon as they finished their contractually obligated other game. I don't know why he didn't just name drop the day before here, as it was already revealed, but maybe it shows a lack of confidence once again. Now that we have everything else out of the way, let's get into the dumpster fire that was about to be the day before. In April, they decided to present the world with some delightful and very much real gameplay footage. This man was playing like Velma without her glasses. What is this aim? But other than the shitty aim, many people were actually getting slightly skeptical, mainly because games like Cyberpunk and No Man's Sky looked promising in past trailers but were terrible upon release. But this didn't deter Fntastic, and on October 21st, they announced an official release date of June 21st, 2022. As the June release date was fast approaching, Fntastic must have finally found their glasses and realized that they weren't anywhere near a finished or probably even a playable game. But instead of just outright delaying the game for more time, they would announce that they were switching to Unreal Engine 5 in May. Just 1 month before release, and they now decide to switch engines? It just doesn't add up. But whatever. The game was now to be released in March of 2023. Though since they were switching engines, that means the game would have to be built up practically from scratch. So all those previous 3 years of development were literally for nothing, and now the game would have to be made in under 1 year. At this point, Fntastic finally put their thinking caps on and realized that, hey, maybe working on such a massive game with a small development team isn't probably the best idea. But instead of scaling back the scope, they decided to begin searching for volunteers. I assume because they already sunk so much money into nothing and just didn't have enough to hire more skilled developers. Prop Night, being their only source of income, had a peak of only 6,715 players while being priced at $10. If we multiply these numbers together and take away Steam's 30% cut, they would have made no more than about $20,145. And then we take that number and multiply it by 2 to get an actual estimate, because I didn't realize the game was $20 on release and not $10, not counting any refunds and other currencies, which wouldn't even be enough to pay a full-time developer in Singapore, the country the company was located in, where the average salary for a developer seems to go for the equivalent of $85,000 a year at the lowest. I should also add that some of these volunteers were apparently being paid actual salaries, which at that point they were just regular employees. Although I myself could find no proof that any other entity besides Mytona invested into their development, there's no way in hell they would have survived this long if they didn't have outside help. I can only assume they took out loans or some venture capitalist came around to toss some bands their way. After all, the day before was the most wishlisted game on Steam at some point, and though wishlisting doesn't directly give the developers money, it does at least show an interest in the game. But even then, there's only so much an investor would agree to put into a project before deciding enough is enough. Fast forward to January of 2023, and the game would suddenly vanish from the Steam store page altogether. Did they finally decide to give up and move on? No. It turns out that there was an alleged copyright dispute. The story goes that Fntastic hadn't filed a trademark for the name the day before, and so after uploading the reveal trailer, someone else swooped in and held the name for ransom. The ransomer or whatever then repeatedly contacted Fntastic to pay up before they released the monster inside of them, but he was unfortunately left undelivered. The monster came out and the day before was attacked. The reason I emphasized the word allegedly there was because of what happened following this dispute. Fntastic delayed the game up until November. A copyright dispute is pushing the game back another 8 months? I don't believe it. And I was right not to believe it, because almost immediately after, they came out and said that they would have delayed the game regardless of the dispute dispute, so why even make it sound like it was due to it? Jesus, these guys are so confusing. The funniest consequence of this little debacle was that the subreddit moderators on r/the day before were now not even sure themselves if the game was real or not. But thankfully for Fntastic, a vigilante swooped in to save them from more criticism. Wolf, as he was known for the past 6 years in the gaming world, threw out a ticket calling for the entire subreddit to be turned over to him, as the moderators were supposedly inactive and didn't even officially work for Fntastic, so they weren't good representation. We also learned that a separate subreddit, r/day before game, had been created in order to have more control, but that subreddit went absolutely nowhere, and what Reddit moderator or admin wants to have power over absolutely nobody. After 4 days of no response, Wolf got impatient. 4 days is our new lucky number now. But you know what's even more funny? This Wolf character apparently wasn't even an official employee either. He called himself one, but then would later claim he was just a volunteer. He also banned anyone that criticized the game, but then also started doubting the game's existence as well. The only thing this vigilante did was tarnish the already fragile name of Fntastic. Moving on to February, and we would finally get our first real official gameplay video, and dear lord, what the hell happened? This looks and feels just like PUBG Mobile, with gameplay just as boring. Sorry for the diss. And why does she walk around like she just shit her pants? Where did all the textures go? Where did the intense gameplay go? Where did all that development go? Where did my wife go? These are all questions that were left unanswered. After this video was released, people would go on Twitter to expose Fntastic for not only slapping around pre-made assets, but also for blatantly ripping off Call of Duty shot for shot. And the title card looked exactly like The Last of Us, so clearly the game was lacking in originality. Anyway, some more empty promises and another delay later, and the game would finally see the light of day on December 7, 2023. In early access, by the way. All this time when we finally got to a beta. I don't think I even need to talk about the game itself. Enough has already been said about it by this point. Just a poorly made asset flip with so many glitches and bugs we'd have to call pest control. Though, even after all the negative press this game received up until this point, it still hit a peak of 38,104 players. With a price of $40 and taking into consideration Steam's 30% cut once more, they would have stood to make no more than $457,248 from this game. Again, not counting refunds or other currencies, which honestly is quite massive, at least when you don't consider the fact that all that money was only in revenue. You still had to take away the expenses before looking at profits. Though we don't have any estimate as to what their expenses look like, we have word from Fntastic as to what their profits look like. A staggering $0. According to them, every single last penny went straight into paying off all the debts they had accumulated after all this time. Whether or not you choose to believe them, that's up to you. I do believe them, however, as considering everything I mentioned in this video, they were under such poor management and direction that their money would have been better spent going into a paper shredder. I wouldn't be surprised if their debts hadn't reached a minimum of $1 million by this point. Prop Night probably wasn't even enough to offset its own costs. They weren't earning money from their past games as you couldn't buy Dead Dozen and Radiant 1 was priced at $1 measly, and sales from the Wild 8, if any at all, mostly went to Hype Train Digital, not Fntastic. They bled through so much money that I'm surprised Mytona even stuck with them until the very end. I can only assume that they saw potential in the sales from the day before past all the dog shit on their screen. But that's all just speculation. The conclusion I came to after researching this company for the past week now. And unfortunately, unless you want to outright just label them as a scam, this is the best conclusion we can reach to, as the company is no longer with us. Just 4 days after the release, Fntastic would instantly shut down their entire studio and delist the day before from Steam, claiming that they, well, didn't have enough money to continue. But though you can't buy the day before right now, you can still buy their other games listed on Steam, except for Dead Dozen, of course. I'm assuming that money would either go into the void or into paying off more debt, but you shouldn't buy it either way. And what's also interesting is that the Wild 8 is no longer listed under Fntastic, but instead 8 points. People assume it's because they're getting ready for their next scam, but I think it's just Hype Train Digital trying to disconnect themselves from such a terrible name by this point. As of now, Fntastic is most likely in the process of liquidating all their assets. They claim to still be working with Mytona to refund everyone that had purchased the game, so hopefully those out there that actually paid for it get their money back. There is still a slight possibility these guys can come out of nowhere again to sell another game, most likely through Kickstarter as they had success with it in the past. So just be aware. Remember the faces and the name Gotovsvev, or however the fuck you pronounce that. Jesus. Although I do not believe that they are outright scammers, their overestimations of their skills and lack of planning with terrible direction will more likely than not lead to you losing your hard-earned money. And why toss that money at them when you can toss it into my Patreon? No, just kidding. I don't have a Patreon. I do have a membership and supers if you wanted to support me. All the money will go into buying new equipment because, guys, my headphones broke like Lego pieces. I had to tape them together. Sometimes when I wear them, they dig into my skull, so sorry if the audio is poorly mixed for the next month. I'm relying mostly on monitor audio here, which sucks. Anyways, that's the end of the video. Leave a like and subscribe if you liked the video. Comment down below the day after. I've been Fntastic Claus. You've been watching The Day Before I Lose My Sanity. Merry Christmas and ciao ciao.